We continue now at the top of Daf Nun Zayin and Beis and Meseches Kiddushin. This is Kiddushin Daf 57b. On the previous summit, the Gemara brought the brisa which said that the pasuk that says "V'zeh lo tochlu mehem," that you can't eat from the following non-kosher birds, it comes to include that you're not allowed to eat from the bird of the mitzorah that is shechted, that is slaughtered. And the Gemara asks, how do you know it's not coming to include the bird that is sent away, the mishulachas? Maybe that's the one that's prohibited. And the Gemara says we don't generally find that that living animals are prohibited. And so the Gemara asks, is that really true? But what about muksa v'nevad? What if you have a situation of muksa and nevad? Those are animals that are alive, that are either designated for avodah zarah or served as avodah zarah. The balei chayim nenu v'asiri, those are living animals, and they are prohibited. So you see, you do have a situation of living animals that are prohibited. And so again, maybe the pasuk that says v'zeh shelo tochlu mehem, maybe that's coming to include the bird that's sent away as the one that is prohibited. And Rashi explains muksa behema shehuksa l'takrovas avodah zarah. You have, let's say, an animal that's set aside for avodah zarah, asura legavo, it's asur to bring as a carbon. Kedamar b'tzmura, like it says in Tmura, min ha-behema lahotzi es harova v'nirba, min ha-bakar lahotzi es ha-nevad, to exclude again the animal that is worshipped for avodah zarah, min ha-tzon lahotzi es ha-muksa, and also you have min ha-tzon, that comes to exclude the animal that's set aside. Nevad sheheshtacha velo, nevad means you actually bow to the animal. Again, muksa means that it was set aside for avodah zarah. So those are balei chayim and they're asur. And so you see, you could have balei chayim that are asur. And the Gemara says it's not a proof. Ki asiri, those are only prohibited legavoa. Those are only prohibited to bring to the Beis Hamikdash, to bring as a carbon. But lehedyod mishra shari, but they're still permitted to a regular person, and therefore it's no proof. We still don't find in general that animals that are alive are prohibited, and that's how we know that when the pasuk comes to include the bird of the mitzorah that it's prohibited, it's talking about the bird that is shechted, the one that is slaughtered. But the Gemara continues, Maskiv la Rabbi Yirmiyah. Rabbi Yirmiyah asks, Hare roveya v'nir, but what about roveya v'nir? But that refers to animals that have relations with people, bestiality. So those animals, roveya v'nirba be'edim, let's say there are witnesses, so the balei chayim nenu v'asiri, those are living animals, and they are prohibited. You do find living animals that are prohibited. And to that the Gemara responds, Alom Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai. Rather, Rabbi Yochanan says in the name of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, Lo matzinu rov balei chayim shasrim. In general, by the majority of animals, we don't find that they're prohibited when they're alive, but there are some exceptions, like roveya and nirba. And Rashi explains, Roveya v'nirba be'edim de b'nei skilaninu. Those animals, if you have an animal, again, that committed this act of bestiality with a person, so that animal has to be stoned. It says you have to kill the woman and the animal. That's talking about the animals, the Roveya in that case. V'nirba, then you have nirba, where the animal is the female. It says v'esabehema tarogu. V'alfinan le'el mishenigmar dino nasar. We learned earlier that once there's a gemar din on the animal, it's prohibited. V'afilu shachtu, even if it was shechted. Now, the reason why we say over here that there are witnesses to it, because the halach is it doesn't get skila, the animal is not stoned if there's only one witness. The Amar Mar, the master said, Kemisas bailam kach misas ashur, just like you need two edim by the bailam, by the owner, so too when it comes to the ox. And the Gemara continues, Devei Rabbi Yishmael Tan, in the yeshiva of Rabbi Yishmael it was taught, Yomar Kra, because the pasuk says, V'shilach al pnei hasod, it says you send it out to the field. Again, that's talking about the bird that is sent out by Mitzorah. We're going to use now a different pasuk to show that that bird is mutter, and we learn now from that pasuk, since it says al pnei hasod kisada, we compare the bird to a field. Masada muteris, just like a field is mutter. Afhai nami muteris, so to this bird that's sent away, that's how we know this bird is mutter. But the Gemara says, Hai sada lahachi udasa, but can you really use the word sada for this? Hahumi boile lechidatanya, isn't it needed for what's taught in the following brisa? It says sada, it says a field, shalo yamod biyafo v'yizraken al yam. It says you have to send it out to the field, meaning to say you can't stand in Yafo and then throw it over to the sea, or begabas, you can't stand in Gabas v'yizraken al midbar and then throw it over to the wilderness. V'shalo yamod chutz le'ir, and you can't stand outside the city, v'yizraken besocha ir, and then throw it into the city. Rather, what you have to do is he has to stand in the city, and then throw it outside the wall of the city. That's what the mishulachas is. So that's what we're using sada for. So how could Devei Rabbi Yishmael say that the word sada is to teach us that the animal that sent away, the bird that sent away, is mutter? And so the Gemara says, V'idach, but the other one can respond to you, Im kein nichtov kros sada. If that was the case, it would just write sada. My hasada. Why does it say hasada with a hey? Shma min otarti. So that's what we see. You see both of these ideas. Again, you see the idea that it's mutter like a field, and you also see this idea that it has to be that you're standing within the city and you throw it outside, you send it out outside the walls of the city. And finally, the Gemara gives a last answer how we know that the Mishulachas is the one that is mutter. Rava Amar Rava says, Lo Amra Torah Shaleach L'Takala. The Torah wouldn't say to send it out, and then it would be a stumbling block if it would be usher. So now you're sending it out, someone might find it and it's really prohibited. That would be a Takala. Therefore, it cannot be that the one that is sent out is prohibited. And Rashi explains Yafo, the city of Yafo, Chomos al Hayam. So the wall of Yafo is by the sea. That's why you're in Yafo and you might throw it to the sea. Or Begabas, and Gabas, Chomos al Midbar. The wall of Gabas is by the wilderness. Rachman Amar Sada. The point over here is that the Torah says a field, so you have to stand again inside the city. You throw it outside of the city, outside of the walls of the city to the field. She'omed b'socha ir v'yizrakena chutz l'chom. He has to stand within the city and throw it outside of the walls of the city. Min chsiv v'shilach esat tzipor achayol michutz lo'ir. It says again, you send it outside the city. Michlal de'omed bo'ir. So that implies he's actually standing in the city. U'mishalcha el hachutz. Then he sends it outside the city. De'iba'omed chutz lo'ir, because if he's already standing outside the city, my v'shilach el michutz lo'ir. What is the v'shilach? How is he sending it outside the city if he already is outside the city? It's already outside the city before he sends it away. And then the Rashi then says, Rava says again a final answer that you don't send it out l'takala. Svarahu, it's logical. Shamashulachas muteris. It has to be that the one that is sent out is muter. The lo amr haTorah shaleach l'takala. The Torah wouldn't say to send it out and cause a stumbling block. Shetehei lemichshol, because then already again it's going to be a stumbling block. Lemichshol avon v'yilchedena adam yochlena. A person might capture it and eat it, and it's prohibited, so it cannot be. Ukra da amran le'el. And now Rashi points out the pasuk that we brought earlier, l'rabo says hamashulachas, which says to include the Mishulachas. So here we're already saying you don't need a pasuk. We're saying it would be a stumbling block. It's obvious it's mutter. Asmachta bi'alma, so that's just an asmachta. But again, really, according to Rava, the source is that the Torah would never say that you should send it out l'takola. And we will take a look at Tosas as well. Kol she'omed tocha ir v'yizrakena chutz l'chom. Again, he has to stand in the city and send it outside the wall. Perish hakuntres devesadolom hani shiluach. Rashi says the field, you can't send it out in the field. Devina meshilach al pnei asad. You need to send it out to the field from inside. But Tosas asks, "V'kash, it's difficult. Shari mitzora haya v'nitar chutz l'ir." We're talking here about a mitzora. He's being purified outside the city. Shari asr likonis lifnim menachom. But the point is that a mitzora is not allowed to enter into these walled cities. So therefore, how could it be that he's inside the city and sending it out? And Tosas answer, V'yesh lomar d'shema achar kapara. Tosas say that maybe after the kapara, haya kohen nosa, maybe the Kohen would take it. Or hu shlucho, maybe him, or maybe some messenger of his, la'ir, they would take it into the city, u'mishalcha chutz la'ir, and then send it outside of the city. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Bisar Nazir, again a man is Makadesh, a woman with the hair of a Nazir, that's also Asr Bahana, and therefore it's not a good Kiddushin. And the Gemara says, Minolan, from where do we know that the hair of a Nazir is Asr Bahana? Diomar Krok, as the Pasuk says, Kadosh Yeh Gadol Peras Arosho. It says that it's Kadosh Yeh, it's holy, talking about the hair of the Nazir. Gidulo Yeh Kodesh. What that means is that the hair that grows, that is going to be Kadosh, it's going to be holy, and therefore it's going to be similar to something that is Hektish, it's going to be Asr Bahana. But the Gemara says, Ima Kodesh Tofes as Dama, but when it comes to Kodesh, so again, if you use money, you can redeem the Kedusha onto the money, V'yotze l'chulin, and then the animal itself goes l'chulin. Afsar Nazir, so too when it comes to the hair of a Nazir, Tofes as Damav, we should say the same thing, that the money should take the Kedusha, V'yotze l'chulin, and it should be able to go l'chulin, and that's not true. And the Gemara says to that, Mi Karinan Kodesh, is it read as Kodesh, Kadosh, Karinan? It's read as Kadosh, and so therefore it's not Tofes as Damav when it comes to the hair. And Rashi explains, Amar Krok Kadosh Yeh Chaser Vav. Rashi explains, when it says in the Pasuk Kadosh Yeh, it doesn't say it with the Vav. It doesn't say Kuf Dalet Vav Shin. Chaser Vav Ksiv, it's written without a Vav. Midrash Be Kodesh. And therefore we can darshan it as if it's read, as if it says Kodesh. Kodesh Hu, V'zeh Echad Min Hashlosha Asr B'Masoras Chaserim. This is one of the examples where letters are missing. And then that's why the Gemara said Kadosh Karinan. We read it as Kadosh, even though it is written in a way where it could be Kodesh. Lahachi Karinan Kadosh. The reason why we read it as Kadosh, L'ma'ute Damav, to exclude the money, that you can't redeem it. Shein Din Kedusha, all of the Kedusha does not go onto the money. Kodesh Mashma Shem Kedusha. When you say Kodesh, that's like a Shem Kedusha, that it has a name of holiness. But Kadosh Mashma, when we say Kadosh, it means who Kadosh. It means that it is Kadosh. That's the idea, that it is Kadosh, but not the money. L'ma'ute Damav. We are excluding the money being tofes that kedusha. And we should clarify over here that when we talk about hektish that can be redeemed, that is generally referring to hektish bedek habayis. That is when a person is makdish something for the purpose of the repair of the Beis HaMikdash, not necessarily for the purpose of a carbon. That kind of hektish again can be redeemed onto money, and that is not true when it comes to the hair of the Nazir. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, "Bepeter chamor." If a man is makadesh a woman with peter chamor, the firstborn of a donkey, that also is asur bahana. It's not a good kiddushin. And the Gemara says, "Nema masnis and delok Rabbi Shimon." Let us say that our Mishnah does not follow the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. The Tanya, as we learned in a brayso, peter chamor asur bahana. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says that a peter chamor is asur bahana. Rabbi Shimon matter, but Rabbi Shimon says it's mutter. It seems like the Mishnah is saying that it's asur bahana like Rabbi Yehuda, not like Rabbi Shimon. And the Gemara says, Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rabba bar Avua. Rav Nachman says that Rabba bar Avua says, La'achar arefa v'divrei hakol. We're talking over here after the arefa, after the breaking of the neck, and that actually everybody agrees to, that it is asur bahana. And Rashi says, Pluksa de Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Shimon bebechoros. This machlokas Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon by Peter Chamor is in bechoros. La'achar arefa v'divrei hakol. After the breaking of the neck, it follows everyone's opinion. The Amar Hasam u'mod Rabbi Shimon. It says over there that Rabbi Shimon, who says mutter bahana, he admits la'achar arefa, that after they break the neck of the animal, that they do that by the Peter Chamor. He admits that after that procedure, shu asur, that it is asur. V'gamar arefa me'egla arufa. He learns out of Gzer Shav. It says arefa over here when we're talking about Peter Chamor, and it says arefa, of course, by egla arufa. Just like by egla arufa, there's an isur hana, so too over here. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Basar b'cholav, if a man is makadesh a woman with meat and milk, so that is also asur b'hana, and therefore it's not a good kiddushin. And the Gemara says, Menolan, from where do we know that Basar b'cholav is asur b'hana? The Tana of Rabbi Shmuel, it was taught in the yeshiva of Rabbi Shmuel. Lo sevashel gedi b'chalev imo, you can't cook the gedi, the goat, in the milk of its mother. Gimel pa'amim, it says that in the Torah 3 times, and therefore we learn out from that, echad isra achila, v'echad isra hana, v'echad isra bishul. It's referring to the prohibition to eat Basar b'cholav, the prohibition to get hana, to get benefit from Basar b'cholav, and the prohibition to cook together Basar and cholav, meat and milk. And so therefore you see from here that there is an isra hana when it comes to Basar b'cholav. And the Gemara continues, Masnisin de Loki Aitana de Tanya. Our Mishnah does not follow the Tana in the following brisa. Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda says, Basar b'cholav, asr b'achila umutter b'hana. Asr b'cholav, when it comes to Basar b'cholav, it's asr to eat it, but it's actually mutter to get benefit. Shenemar, as it says in the pasuk, Ki am kadosh atol Hashem elokecha, lo sevashel gedi b'chalev imo. It says, your holy nation, you don't cook the gedi in the milk of its mother. Well, halonu omer, and further on it says, V'anshe kodesh tion li. It says in the pasuk, you'll be holy to me. Malahalan, just like over there when the pasuk says V'anshe kodesh tiyun li, pasuk goes on to say Ubasar basada treifa lo tochelu, you can't eat the treifa. That's talking about not eating. So malahalan, just like over there asr ba'achila, we're talking about something that's asr to eat umutter b'hana, but it's mutter to get benefit. Afkan, so to over here asr ba'achila umutter b'hana. According to the opinion of Shimon ben Yehuda, when it comes to basar b'cholav, it's asr to eat it, but it is mutter to get benefit. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, if a man is mekadesh a woman v'chulin shenishchetu ba'azara, if he's mekadesh a woman with chulin, non-sacred animals that were shechted in the azara, you're only supposed to shecht karbanos in the azara. A person takes chulin and shechts it b'azara, so that's going to be asr b'hana. And the Gemara says, Menohan imili, from where do we know this? Amr Rabbi Yochanan mishum Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yochanan says in the name of Rabbi Meir, Amra Torah shechot shali b'shali v'shelcha b'shelcha. The Torah says that you shecht mine, meaning you shecht karbanos, in my area, in the Beis HaMikdash, and you shecht your animals, meaning the animals that are not karbanos, you shecht that in your area, b'sharecha, you don't shecht it in the Beis HaMikdash. And we learn from that, mashali b'shelcha asr, just like if you shecht mine in yours, meaning if you shecht karbanos outside of the Beis HaMikdash, it's asr, av shelcha b'shali asr, so too if you shecht your animals in mine. If you take chulin and you shecht them b'azara, that's also going to be asr. But the Gemara says, but when it comes to shechting mine in yours, meaning if you shecht karbanos outside of the Beis HaMikdash, there's a punishment of kares. So if a person shechts yours in mine, meaning if a person shechts chulin ba'azara, that's going to be a punishment of kares. The Gemara says, Amar Kra, the pasuk says, V'el pesach ol moed lo heviu lahakriv karban la'Hashem v'nichras. It talks about kares specifically when the person takes a karban and does not bring it and does not slaughter it in the Beis HaMikdash. Al karban anush kares, on a carbon, there's a punishment of kares, but al chulin shenishchatu ba'azara. But when it comes to chulin that was shechted in the azara, so ein onish kares, there's no punishment of kares in that situation. Specifically, there's kares when it's a carbon outside of the Beis HaMikdash. And the Gemara continues, well, if you're learning chulin shenishchatu ba'azara from karbonos that are shechted outside the Beis HaMikdash, you can refute that limud. Because we can say as follows, when it comes to mine in yours, when it comes to karbonos outside of the Beis HaMikdash, there's a punishment of kares. That's not true over here. So how can you really learn out one from the other? And so the Gemara instead says, Elo Amar Abaye, rather Abaye says, Mehoch, it comes from here. From the following is where we know that Chulin Shenishchatu Ba'azara is Asr B'Hana. It says, V'shachatu, V'shachat Oso, V'shachat Oso. It says, Yeshechted. 3 times it mentions the idea that you bring it to the Oel Moed to Shechtet. Tlosa Kroy Yiseri, it's 3 extra psukim. Matam and Lomer, what does the pasuk say this for? Lafisha Nemar, because the pasuk says, Ki Yirchak Mimcha Hamakom V'zavacht. It says, when the place is far away from you, you're allowed to slaughter animals that are not karbonos. You don't have to bring them as a carbon. You don't have to bring an animal as a carbon in order to eat from the meat. You can just not have it be a carbon, and you can shecht it outside of the Beis HaMikdash. But we learn from that pasuk, Barichuk makom atazoveach, far away from the Mikdash, that's where you do the slaughtering. You can't shecht it near the Beis HaMikdash, meaning prat lechulin shelo yishchatu ba'azar. It comes to exclude if you have an animal that's not sacred, you have an animal that's not a carbon, it should not be shechted in the azara. Now I only know that's true by an animal that's, let's say, that's not kadosh. Let's say you have an animal that you did not make sacred, and it's tamimim, it doesn't have a blemish. So there we would say haruuyim li karev. There we would say that an animal that's one of the tamimim, an animal that doesn't have a blemish, it could theoretically be brought as a carbon, and so therefore that kind of animal you're not allowed. If it's chulin, you can't shecht it in the azara. But minayin l'rabos bali mumen, how do you know to include an animal that has a blemish which couldn't be brought as a carbon anyway? Maybe that you are allowed to shecht in the azara. Marbani as bali mumen, but the Gemara says no, we include bali mumen as well. Shekein min hamachshir, because it's a kind of animal that could be brought as a carbon. In other words, it has a blemish, so you can't bring it as a carbon. But in theory, if it didn't have a blemish, this is the type of animal that can be brought as a carbon, so it's treated in the same fashion. And the Gemara continues, Minayin l'rabos as achai. Well, how do we know? The Brisa continues, how do we know to include the wild animal? Achai is not even a kind of animal that can be a carbon. Marbani as achai shi b'shchita kebehema. The Gemara says, no, we include achai as well, because that's something that is shechted just like a behema, so we treat it in the same fashion. And the Gemara says, Minayin l'rabos as ha'ofos. Well, from where do we know to include the birds? There, when it comes to birds, Rashi says the shchita is not mefureshes, it's not explicit in the Torah. And the Gemara says to that, Talmud Lomer, the pasuk says, V'shachatu v'shachatoso v'shachatoso. Again, it says these psukim, v'shachatu v'shachatoso, and so therefore we learn from there the ofos as well. And the Gemara continues, Yachal lo yishchot v'mshachad yehei mutter. Now I might think you can't shecht, you're not allowed to shecht it in the azara, but if you do, it's still mutter. Who says that it's prohibited if you do it? Talmud Lomer, the pasuk says, Ki yirchak mimcha hamakom v'zavachta v'yachalta. It says again, the place is far away, and you'll slaughter. When you have an animal that's not a carbon, you slaughter far from the Beis HaMikdash. Mashat hazoveach b'richuk makom ataocha. But we learn from that pasuk, it says v'zavachta v'yachalta. You're going to slaughter it and eat it. That which you slaughter properly far away, you can eat. V'yataochel mashat hazoveach b'makom karav. But you're not allowed to eat something which you slaughtered in a close place. That already is not going to be allowed. Prat l'chulin shenishchatu b'azara. Again, that comes to exclude chulin that is shechted in the azara. And again, the Gemara says, V'yein li ala tamimim, that I only know that you can't eat it when we're talking about tamimim. You're talking about animals without blemishes. And Rashi explains, Prat l'chulin shelo yishchatu ba'azara el tamimim. Again, the Gemara said, I might think it's only by animals without a blemish, over uyo hakarava hakasam medaber, meaning maybe it's only by animals that could in theory be karbonos. Because if you had animals that couldn't be karbonos, so they're actually, even in the midbar, you didn't have to bring as karbonos, you were allowed to shecht it and eat it anyways, because it was something that wasn't even fit to be a carbon, there wasn't even a havamina. You would bring it as a carbon, so how do I know that it applies to animals with a blemish as well? And to that the Gemara said, Shekain min hechsher, again, that's a kind of animal that could be brought in the Beis HaMikdash, lahakrib, in theory, if it didn't have the blemish, it could be brought as a carbon. Kevan the dami luhu b'hachi asi lemigmar lei b'mamatzino lahachmer v'lesser. We can learn it out. It's the same thing when it comes to an animal with a blemish. It's the same as an animal that doesn't have a blemish. There's a problem over there of chulin shenishchatu ba'azara. And Rashi continues. The Gemara said we know by a chaya as well. She b'shchita kevehema, because that's slaughtered like an animal. Viskish lepsule hamukdashin b'parsha zos drush of this pasuk in Chulin mapsule hamukdashin b'shchita. Just like when it comes to psule hamukdashin, it's something that is slaughtered af tzvi va'ayol b'shchita. So too when it comes to a deer or an ayol, it's going to be slaughtered v'kevan de b'shchita. And the point of the Gemara is, since the chaya is shechted iskish lahu, since there's a comparison when it comes to slaughtering it, equal and migmar nami mina shalotei shchita b'azara. You also learn out other halachas that it shouldn't be a shchita in the azara. The chol devar zvicha asar achmana. The point is, anything that is meant to be shechted, the Torah prohibits, if it's chulin, that it should be shechted in the azara. And again, minayin l'ravos it's ofos. From where do we know to include the birds? Shein shchitasim mefureshes b'Torah. As we said, there's no shchita mefurish in the Torah, and so then the Gemara said we include the birds as well from the pasuk v'shachtu v'shacharoso v'shacharoso hachi garsina b'Torah's kohanim tamad lomer v'shachtu v'shacharoso v'shacharoso. This is the gears in Torah's kohanim v'achinami garsina b'sifri, the same gears in the sifri upeirusha, and the explanation is chad l'chaya v'chad l'ofos v'chad l'isra achila b'diavad. One is for chaya, one is for ofos, and one is for the fact that you can't eat it if you do shecht it in the azara. And Rashi continues and notes udukatoni mar b'neis achaya, when it says that I include the chaya because it's b'shchita, doesn't seem like it's coming from the pasuk of v'shachtu v'shacharoso v'shacharoso. Hachi kamar just means as follows: ilo kasav koref, not for these psukim again of v'shachtu v'shacharoso v'shacharoso. So you could anyways include it because it is something that is shechted, is something that is slaughtered, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Nun Ches Amud Aleph.